Yeah, I'm excited. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having me. Sorry for the delay. We had some technical difficulties, but I think now we're all good to commence with my presentation, which I titled Music as Hyperdimensional Technology. So, Khodro Eshun, in his seminal essay on Afrofuturism, asks us at the very outset of his essay to imagine a future where archaeologists are digging and looking for the remnants of our present or their past. And he asks us to consider what they would find. And so I was thinking about two other questions that are there in this scene that are not asked by Eshun explicitly. And namely, one of them is, where do they dig? And the other one is, what if they find nothing? Or in other words, two questions that ask us about why are they digging, where, and what are they digging for? And so it's a question about how we relate to our past and our present. And by asking these two questions, I'm trying to point to how there is a question of space in this question of time that Eshun allows us to make. And secondly, of course, also how there is always a question about who is looking and how and what for. Such question is one of listening, thus. And so how do we listen to the world? What do we listen for? And how do we engage it and also its silences? It is thus also working towards opening our ears, towards opening listening to the unheard, but also to the unthought and the unknown. Music becomes or can be a transformative practice, a space transformative practice, such as examples such as the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, or the Sondra Orchestra, amongst so many others, have carried it forward to us to our time, or for us into our time, we could say. So this musical practice or this music can be a way to think beyond the confines of a world for only some, those authorized to be in it, in opposition to a silence or the silenced ones and unthought, and the planet as a space of some kind of what we could call poetic relations, which is to say relations that exceed what we can measure and know. Let me propose this here, despite the fact that or the danger that it might be misunderstood, but in any ways it will be through the presentation and my examples that I hope to make it more clear. It is this music or this musical practice that is about, it is about lives and the whole planet and how we can care for space and the planet. Such is the task of making Black Lives Matter. Such is a black technology like the one Eshun asks us to imagine. Like hyperdimensional, so this is how I conceive of this notion of hyperdimensional instruments or music makers. Music as a technology that thinks with the unknown can become a radical world-refiguring kind of thing, or ship like the mothership or the orchestra. I'm going to share pieces that reflect on this relationship between space, but also space and movement in it, and our relationship through movement with space, or how we make space. And also, especially focusing on notions of being in relation with space that are not a concept of colonizing or conquering space, but rather try to think it in a different way than that. Something that maybe we could say flows with blackness, with this planet, with this space's unthought relation, with space's silence. As will become evident, this is also a question of recognizing how moving through spaces changes you, how you not only affect the world, but how such also does things to you, and most importantly, how every space has its silences, is full of silences of unknowns. In musical terms, these thoughts take on multiple ways of expression, and actually it is also through musical terms that I can articulate what I'm speaking about today here with you. There are the ways in which such concerns are expressed in musical materials such as timbre, pitch, tuning, gesture, and rhythm, but also in sort of more what we usually call the musical context, such as curation, its social and historical and economic and geographic spaces, and so forth. All of these are addressed in my work. So in 2020, during the pandemic, in the lockdown, I was in New York. So I didn't really leave my home much, and I created this piece called which I called Space Travel from Home. You can see here some image excerpts from it. And in this piece, I created these virtual acoustic spaces. I made them out of my own instruments, out of cymbals specifically. So I would take a very short sample of a cymbal sound that I would create, and then I would sculpt a reverb out of that. Then I would record every week to create this iterative work, almost like a TV show, and travel to these different planets. So you can see here some different planets that I would visit. There are many others, and in this small circle that you can see with the planets, you would see a little, movement going from one planet to another, things like that, when you would look at this TV series. So since it is from my small apartment in Brooklyn during lockdown, I call it Space Travel from Home. I will not show much of this piece, but you can check it out on YouTube if you want. I expanded this idea in another piece, which I will show you a little excerpt of in a second, which was commissioned by Issue Project Room. And in this piece, I expanded on this notion, and I created, again, a universe of these spaces, and this time I represented them in a slightly different way. Instead of images from NASA, I used just colored circles. So these circles here, each one would be a different space. There. And I wanted to add some other parameters to the space to make it a bit more interesting. For example, one very important aspect of spaces is noise. So right now we're in this space, and we hear that we're in this space partially actually because of all this noise, like our rubbing of our clothes and the air and the projector and so forth. So I added little noise sounds inside the different rooms. For example, I added fire or water, like a creek or some wind or some birds, things like that. And then I also added some different filters of the sound, like where I just filter the sound, which was kind of like imagining there was something in the space, like an object or like a door or a window. So these are these gray squares there. Furthermore, this piece is a little different from the Space Travel from Home, because in the Space Travel from Home, I only did everything that was in terms of space traveling and virtual acoustics in post-production. And that was, of course, very easy to do because it was a purely online piece and shared during the lockdown. This piece, I wanted to actually share this experience with the musicians, so I had to do it in real time. And so you will see in the excerpt, there's this red dot that just wanders across this whole map. And the red dot that moves around is actually moved by the musicians most of the time. And they're moving through these different spaces, acoustic spaces. So I'll just play a little excerpt from one movement that's performed by Katrin Schulmeister on double bass of this example. And I'll just have to go and exit into the internet. Okay. Oh. So you saw how traveling. So basically, the musician was traveling around in space while playing. She was doing that with the computer keyboard, and through traveling, the sound changed of the instrument because the acoustics would resonate differently depending on how it's sculpted and where you are in the universe or in each room. Traveling these spaces, it becomes evident how the space thus contributes to the sound of instruments, of the music, also to the speed of rhythms and phrases. The piece consciously thinks about different relations to space and also what role the score has in this relationship between performers and spaces, but also between listeners and spaces. Because both space travel from home and the sound of listening show parts of its score to the listener. The visual becomes an aid for listening or does something to listening itself. With regards to the performer, I engage that in a few different ways. So I have different ways of notating for different movements that I used in this larger piece. And how I developed them is first I would basically sculpt those spaces and then I would go into them myself and I would sing in them. I'd play my little Irish flute into them. I would also do like acoustical measurements, so using a sine tone to check out which frequencies resonate, which frequencies are negatively resonating. So because I use the symbols, the rooms are very unusual in this frequency response. So there's certain frequencies you could hear, they would just linger in the room forever, and others they would really be almost inaudible. This, of course, happens not only with the pitch you play, but with the whole instrument, with the timbre, but also with the room that you're in when you play the instrument. So it affects that room too. And they also create different rhythms, because if something lingers, then it creates a different decay rate in terms of something that doesn't linger. So it changes what gestures you can use. This allows for things like gestures that can be made with pitches that resonate and others that don't, and then you can create chords with single-voiced instruments. One movement is an oboe piece, and you could create, for example, beatings with the room itself. So you're conversing with the room rather than just with instruments. So I created two types of scores out of these experiments. And one is mostly notated, which you see excerpt of below here, with instructions for how to move in space. And over the course of the piece, it varies what I indicate. And then the other notation, one other main notation method is to give something like a map. I imagined it almost like when you visit a place and you get a map and you see where there are hills and where there are valleys. So I give the musicians some notion of there is a hill, there is also a valley. But there's another aspect that kind of emerged that I wasn't aware of first, but that became very crucial to this piece, which is that there's something like different histories emerging or timelines. Because if you have a piece where you start moving around in space and you have different spaces, then when you go to the same space again, you automatically associate whatever you heard in that space with what you hear in that space again, right? So it creates something like timelines or histories. So for example, in this piece or in this score where I have something like a map for performers, I have also some musical fragments over here, you can see those, from the pieces that are completely notated, which you hear first as a listener, or at least one of them. And because of that, you have those series of gestures that are more likely to be there. You could imagine that to be something like a fauna in a space, right? Certain kinds of affordances that a space has, acoustically speaking. And they then translate also into gestures. So I started thinking about space as also as time. So there's always with spaces also a question of time, because I didn't want to recreate, I also didn't want to have this notion of remaking a space every time you enter it, as if there was nothing that was there before. And I think that's very important also for a certain different kinds of relation to space that I was trying to point to in the introduction of my talk, and I try to elaborate more after. But for example, in this graph that I made to visualize it for myself, I realized that there, if you look at just the black rocket, I don't see where, there it is. The black rocket, it would move from one space to another, and then to another, and then maybe it will return. And if that happens, depending on how fast you return, you could imagine of how much stuff happened in the space. And part of that also has to do with how much a space resonates, or sound resonates on a small scale, for example. But then in this piece, I have multiple musicians and also listeners. And so I was thinking, well, they will most obviously be in the space, not always together. So what does that mean? That means there's something like an offset in time. And the offset in time is expressed as something like a relationship between the speed of traveling. So if there's two movements that we listen to, so let's say with the audience, and we listen to it as this graph is telling or showing it to us, we might hear the double bass movement in the first space first, and then we hear oboe movement, just oboe alone, in the same space that the double bass was. Thus now we're connecting this space that we heard the double bass in with the oboe. And when they meet somewhere in a space, then we'll hear them together. So there emerges this relationship between spaces that is articulated between movements of performers. Right now I'm explaining it in a way where we are looking at it just from an observer view where we can see everything. But I didn't think that was very interesting, especially this piece was experienced by the audience online as well. And I was thinking, well, maybe the audience is also traveling. Maybe that's more interesting. So I created a very similar score for the audience, where you would enter the same universe. First you would encounter this, and then you can say, okay, let's play the piece. And we just heard the excerpt from this first movement, which you immediately encounter. And then once you finish it, or if you don't want to finish it, you can even just skip it in the middle or something like that. You enter the same map. And so the listener travels just like the performers. There's another aspect that I added. So, of course, so you see all these numbers. You can click on the numbers and you enter into the space. But when you enter, I added one little aspect to it, which is I wanted the listener to experience also just being in the space without someone speaking in it, basically. If it loads, there we go, okay. So you just hear the space. So you could just sit here for a while, if you want, and just listen to the space. And then suddenly something happens in the space when you press listen to the music, and then that changes your relationship to this space, right? But also if you just leave this on and you go and talk to someone on the phone, which happened to me, and then you listen to the space again, you have also a relationship with the space and what you did while you were in the space. So there is this building of relationships inside spaces, because we collect them together into some kind of set of relations, right? Furthermore, then, there are these different maps of musical spaces, which is also to say something like different ways to listen to them, right? Because each listener also has their own unique experience of the piece and of each space. The music, though, can only emerge when no one map is taken as the ultimate proper mapping. And let me just return to the presentation. And even, because every map is always already only in relation to other maps. Like these histories, or like this traveling through them, that's what makes it into a whole piece or into music. And even the rooms, they continue to evolve through listeners, through listening to them over and over in different contexts and with different instruments and different listeners, because they are instruments too. Part of this is thus a question of how one travels through spaces, how one relates to spaces, and also how such is an expression of a relationship to sound and music. In my string quartet, not in between, I highlight this through a slightly different musical device. I use small bells attached to the bows of the cello and the second violin, and these bells function like markers. They mark the movement of these two instruments, while the other two instruments, they don't have bells. Of course, in some ways, this immediately also points us to a timbral question, if we think timbre as a way to classify or know what an instrument is or which instrument also is playing. So it's also in terms of how we listen to a string instrument or any kind of instrument. At any rate, throughout the piece, something happens to these markers, to the relation between the marked and the unmarked. Bells are very common, so I want to give some background about bells. Bells are very common, or a common way to mark things like space and time, right? Think, for example, of church bells. They mark time, or they also might mark space, like this here is this area, or this here is this area belongs to this person or that person sometimes as well. So it can delimit land, it can also mark property. It can mark property in the form of livestock, like cows or sheep. But bells were also used, particularly in the south of the US, to mark slaves and to control their movement. Thus, the bells here remind us of a question of a relationship between, or a relation to controlling the movement of lives, of people, and particularly black lives. What happens to the movement of the improper, the foreign, the unauthorized, those that are being tracked by the bells, by the state, solely so as to allow for the freedom of movement of those who are unmarked, particularly in this music. So let's listen to this piece, and I think it's yeah, okay, there it is. I think I can play it from in. No. Okay. So the performance is by Jack Quartet, and it's at National Sawdust, and it was commissioned by National Sawdust in New York. Okay. So, what I hear in this piece is how bells don't disappear, which would be something like an erasure of markers from the space of music, which would be an illusion because it would simply displace such marks away from its present space. And as I said, there is still the matter that string instruments do in fact have a sound. Rather, the marks cease to be absolute distinguishers of individuals held in opposition by and for the free movement of the unmarked. The string quartet, in some ways, thus allows for a opaque co-carrying of the bells, which also means that the sound and meaning of the bells continues to change, and that the making of bells, the actual like sound making of that makes us think of bells or hear bells, comes to us as the possibility to move in and as sound, to make sound, to make spaces. Bells become music in dance. In other words, rather than controlling people who are black or close to blackness, such as refugees, foreigners, and so forth, to fashion an exclusionary space and movement, and then movement in opposition to search for the unmarked, this music proposes that we use and make space to support lives. Concludingly, to care for black lives and the silences in spaces is thus also to care for space and making and nurturing spaces, like gardening, to use a metaphor in the spirit of Edouard Glissant, who often talked about the Creole gardens as this unique poetic relationship that's also something spatial. Alongside a chorus of voices, I perform a very similar kind of movement or dramaturgy, I should call it dramaturgy, I think, where also the bells, they cease to be just the markers for individual instruments or performers, and then become something like music. But this piece also is very, I guess, exemplary to extend our space thinking to beyond the confines of some kind of notion of an enclosed field of music or musical parameters. It points quite clearly to how music cannot be actually thought as self-contained, but rather is of lives and spaces. The piece was commissioned for the inaugural year of the new Lucerne Festival Forward in the fall of 2021. And in this piece, I used bells as a way to mark instruments as well, but I also use bells in other fashions or manners. So I will just explain that to you. So I have bells. So these three performers, there are three performers that walk around in space. And then they have bells that I give to musicians on stage. It's a little small maybe, but this here is the stage. So on stage, they then also start using bells at certain points in the piece. But then I also add bells on the ceiling above the audience. This is a little hard to record, so it's not as, you have to kind of imagine it, let me say it like that, when you listen to the piece. Basically, if you're sitting there right above you and maybe over there above you, there would be bells, and they would also become activated. In this piece, apart from, of course, the previous meaning of bells as markers in a general sense, but also the question of controlling and marking movement of lives and people, it's also played in Switzerland, and for Switzerland, the bell sound is very a national kind of identity, both as a symbol, but also actually as a lived experience. If you go hiking in Switzerland, you'll hear bells, cowbells all the time. So actually many audience members told me that they were reminded of the landscape, but it was also kind of strange, maybe that's a good word to use, or maybe disconcerting as well. So the musical material cannot really escape the relation to the space within which we are presenting this piece and creating this piece, because the listener is tied into it as well. And so this is what this piece is kind of working with, I guess we could say. So I'm going to play a longer excerpt of this piece, and yeah, you will kind of have to imagine a little bit that some bells will be above you. It's sort of a little bit audible, but not 100%. Okay. And I want to play. The bells, like in the previous string quartet, become music, cease to be absolute distinguisher of only some. But at the same time, the sound of the bells is also what shifts the very notion of sound, because bells don't have a clear fundamental. That is, their sound, by definition, cannot be pinned down, both in terms of frequency as well as location. Depending on where you are in the room in relation to the bells, you might hear a different sound. Similarly, in this piece, the sound becomes more and more distributed in space, and the music changes depending on where you are in the room. I have musicians positioned around the audience, as well as musicians walking through the audience. And then, of course, you have the ceiling bells. And then the pitches are bounced across musicians throughout the whole hall. In this process also, the pitches that are bouncing around transform. Their pitch changes, as in frequency, because it's so far and you retune it slightly differently. And also their color changes because of instrument changes, of course. The piece engages Switzerland as a space of listeners and subjects, and asks through musical or sonic experiences how such space can or is allowed to sound. This musical event then became a space to be able to talk about Black lives in Switzerland. Through musical work, a space emerged where something could be thought and talked about that had and has no space. It is thus through music that space becomes revealed to be something that we make, that we must tend to, and that tending to space is to listen for those without a voice. And it is through listening in excess of what is given as proper that we gain the capacity to care for space. Thus, music can become a vehicle to change the world, in the sense of space creation as transmutation, we could say. From its entangled resources and relations to its contexts and spaces, music as a transfiguring practice that effectuates changes in all domains of lives, because it is always already entangled in lives. In this sense, when we create music, we can create a music that refigures our relationship to our environment, to each other, and ourselves. In the Issue Project Room piece I showed you, The Sound of Listening, there is another aspect of my music highlighted that, alongside a chorus of voices, asks of the listener and its spaces, or its space. There is a story of transmorphization announced in our space travels, where we change our shape, our sound, our voices, with spaces and our travels. A question of blackness because it is the continual engagement with the unknown, meeting in the unforeseeable, space exceeding the accountable, something like, to go back to Glissant, creolization, or mutation, we might say, in excess of one species or sovereign autonomous spaces. And I'm just going to share a very brief excerpt again from Issue Project Room, just for time's sake. But kind of, it shows, I guess, part of how the spaces work, but also part of how they're created. I'm going to stop it there. But you can listen to the piece in your own way or as a regular video on the Issue Project Room website. Okay. And you heard first me bowing a cymbal on my head, and then the musician who played the flute inside a space made from cymbals bowed was Douglas R. Ewart, who is actually also a member of the AACM, which I mentioned at the beginning, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. And I have a whole record where I bow cymbals on my head, made in that same room. And it looked that way because I also did an opera during the pandemic there, so that's why it was set up like that. So, as you heard, the instruments change their timbre, their pitches, tuning, their rhythmic and gestural modalities, their shape, we could say. It's almost like building changing the instruments in their building or build. And this continual shape-shifting is the expression of our relationality to spaces and each other's lives, or lives in general, but also to the unknown that spaces and lives are, what we cannot foresee yet or know yet, because we have to interact with each other and space to make also space. By that I am also pointing to what we might call silences, that is to say that which is not taught yet, not audible, or we might call it also impossible. The relation to an instrument is the celebration of the unknownness that is us as a relation, that is I as a relation with others, which is something like saying to lose yourself inside the instrument and the instrument inside of you. How an instrument and a performer, and of course a listener, are themselves something like spaces, a place where things meet. We might say it this way. Instruments are amalgamations or something like that of lives lived in the past and of cultural, societal, and economic practices and conditions in the present, as well as environmental conditions, right? For example, the air, or if we were to play underwater or on another planet. For example, also how an instrument is played or playable, partly in its material makeup and affordances, and also in the way we learn it and know an instrument can be played or sound. All of this is dependent on historical, social, and other factors, right? But it is also enmeshed in economics, for example, such as, let's say, the choices for material for different instruments, or how instruments are tuned. And that doesn't only involve, for example, on a string instrument, the strings, but also its body, like the wooden part, because it's tuned to the string tuning, and this tuning also is entangled in all of this. These then also again meet with the space concert hall, the room we're in right now, the reason why it sounds this way. And I think this is what Issue Project Room Piece or Space Travel from Home kind of really showed me very clearly, is that that space affects how I speak even. If I enter these spaces, and those of you who are part of the workshop, if some of you are here right now, you will notice when we try out these virtual acoustic spaces, your voice modulates. And you can maybe notice it if you go into a church or like a very resonant space, or then in a very dead space, and how you change your voice. So it has, even in our tuning as speakers, we don't notice it. So this question is also one about lives and about what music means for worlds, not just this one, but also music can bring other worlds. Or like Marshall Allen from the Sun Ra Orchestra says, that we can make a better world using music. In the last piece that I'd like to share with you, I pondered this space creating capacity of instruments meeting instruments or performers meeting instruments. How an instrument and the performer can make new worlds, changing the material makeup of the instrument over time, because other sound relations become foregrounded or emphasized. How listeners change in time because they can hear something they could never imagine before. How instruments change us. Through them, we become something else, like how we could never make these sounds before them. This piece is a meditation on the role of silences in particular, of breathing in black, of those sounds unattended to and erased, because it is those sounds, if we make them matter, those unthought sounds, or the unknownness of sound, that sound always carries and announces, that actually can bring a better world. Thus the protest for black lives, for black breathing, is about saving the planet, of making impossible worlds, of traveling with this spaceship Earth through and in the outer nothingness to worlds unknown. I'm just going to play a brief example of Laura Cox playing at Carnegie Hill series in New York, the piece called Black Breathing.
So Jessie made this piece called Black Breathing, and it's inspired by a piece of Charles Uzor's called 846, which was written for George Floyd and explores the difference between breathing and silence. What's going on?
I'll stop it there. So we have enough time for questions and conversations. And I just want to thank you all for being here, and the organizer for making this happen. So maybe we can have now some questions and discuss some of what I was trying to make us think about. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you think that maybe more generally sound or music is only related to planet Earth?
Great question. I don't think so. Because actually what I was trying to, the reason why I started using symbols is because I was trying to imagine sounds on exoplanets and how could we, approach generating spaces or experiences like that. And actually, like if we imagine another gas, like a simple way to do that is to imagine we were all just playing always music underwater. We kind of have experience of sound underwater, right? It's so different. And for example, if we think about whales, so they, for example, here, the speed of talking is a completely different one because the waves are so large. And then also the distance, right? Because they could talk almost across the whole planet, if not the whole planet, if I'm not mistaken. So what I started realizing is that the change of material within which the sound propagates, right, changes how we conceive of speech, but also thinking and ourselves. And actually, instruments already are that, which is kind of crazy. So if you have a symbol is actually a metal, and you have an what do you call it? Attack thing, something accentuator, right? That's what it's called, which creates an impulse, and then you have this whole resonator. And actually, the main interesting thing about it is the resonator, how the resonator interferes or resonates, as that is amplifies certain frequencies or not, right? So that is kind of what, to me, this piece opened up as a way of thinking about instruments and also sound. And thus, sound is also exceeding even the notion of listening as having to happen through gas, because underwater is already a little bit the case that we think of it not so much as something that travels to air or gas, but through liquid, right? But when you put a symbol on your head, you're actually vibrating your skull. And so you're hearing sounds that no one else can hear because it's vibrating in your head. And actually you have the same experience when you feel vibrations to your feet. And we do that all the time. And I noticed that because I was in my grandma's house. That image is in my grandma's house. And it's wooden. And if I bow a cymbal on a cymbal stand, which percussionists of you will know, have a very strong they resonate very strongly with the cymbal, and they lead the sound all over. And what happened was it would resonate in the wood and then in my foot. And then I was like, oh, maybe I should put it on my head, right? So it's even not tied to only our notion of ears. So that's maybe the beginning of the answer of this question, but I think it's a huge, expanding one.
Because I asked this question because even, for example, on Mars, it's so frozen that there's no water, so there's basically no ice, but it's so cold that there's a breathing atmosphere. No one knows if there is really sound or not.
Well, we have sound now. Do you know about that?
Okay.
So they sent a microphone in the last one, and we have.
You can hear how you sound in bars and stuff.
Yeah. So literally, the
Yeah.
first sound we ever heard. No, actually, I think there is one before I read about, but I'm not 100% sure how that one worked because it's not recorded on Mars, but it's like sending a signal and receiving it back. That happened before already, but this is the first time we had sound from another planet. You can type in NASA Perseverance rover, and they sent microphones, and you can hear like just the wind. So, for example, everything on Mars is very low because of the composition of gas and atmosphere and everything. Yeah. So, it's crazy, but yeah.
But then through space, it's different because when I don't know, I'm just interested in that, but I don't. Really, when they recorded some what we call pulsar in French, they interpreted it a radio signal and then through speakers, so it's making rhythm. But if the first nature of the signal is not sound, it's
right.
mathematic things.
Yeah, right. So in outer space, there's no air, but there's even very little substances that could like create a wave because sound requires substances to meet. It's literally space. Like you have some molecules that bounce off of each other, create a wave. So the energy can travel through the substance. Now in outer space, there's very few, things that could do that, but that doesn't mean that there is not a certain spectrum of frequency, I guess, but it won't be conceived as sound. But as I was trying to also point to, like sometimes we hear even on Earth, like even us with our bodies, sound through, like for example, bones. So that is not through the air. It's a little different relationship to sound. I think for musicians it's very much always there, because when we play our instruments, we feel it in our bodies. Yeah. But I wouldn't know what we would do if we could like go there and make music. I heard somebody told me that there's actually people doing recordings on the Interstellar Space Station, which must be very fascinating. I mean, it's different, but it's still weird because you have no gravity, and gravity also does stuff to your interaction with the instrument and stuff. So I haven't heard those, but yeah, it's a really large question, and I think an interesting one as a composer and musician and so forth. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
This kind of music requires specific state of mind.
Mm.
And, did you felt this music influence your like regular life, or also they have problems with connecting this state of mind, because this is really like something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's actually, I realized this more and more. Specifically my approach, I'm very interested in also changing the listeners, which means whenever, this is I think why I started doing or attempting or subconsciously started like giving scores to listeners, because these are very they're like TV shows. You could sit there and watch things happen like visually, and at the same time in the sound, and it helps to change what we listen to or for. And actually the same also in alongside a chorus of voices, which is maybe not even just visually, but but also your own sensation or experience of your own space. Like when you see something up, and when somebody approaches you, right? When somebody runs to you with sound, or when you hear something above you, it changes how you relate to yourself, and that's very much part of what I'm trying to do, I think. So it's about refiguring what we think we are. There's a brilliant book by Ed Cohen, which is looking at a conception of our body that is very much actually tied to our historical situation. For example, a lot of the discourse around our body that we know, which is a lot to do with an organism is out there and here am I, and this organism either benefits me or is antagonistic to me, emerged at the same time as the notion of the sovereign nation state, of different nations also having friends and enemies. So this very notion of the body is already tied into also a political notion and the notion of space. So my work has to automatically deal with this question of what is my body, what is my mind, where does my listening end or begin. And whenever we make these delimitations of us or our lives, then we're not listening to space or the silences of us or whatever. So it's very much about changing the listener. And for that, it means the listener has to do work. And it also means you cannot expect to always get everything. You're not allowed to have this ownership relation to my music, I think. In that, you cannot, because you have to build a relationship. And this relationship is partly only yours, but it's also a relationship between you and musicians, you and your own life and things like that. There's very much, I think, that kind of, maybe you could call it a critique or also a celebration of actually what I think music, what is the good or the most promising thing about music, also for the problems of our world and also for thinking about our relationship to this planet, for example, which, I mean, we need to change from a notion of friends and enemies, of organisms that are external to us, either as friends because they benefit us or enemies because they're evil to us, or of people who are not inside the friend-enemy relation because they're not citizens, right? Or of regions of space, such as Africa was delimited as a wild space or the Wild West, and now I was talking to Martin about outer space, the same problem. And now we're throwing all these satellites into outer space like it's just a wild, free, open space, but it's closing us into Earth, and it's very dangerous too because it will destroy our technological advancements, which also means our lives as we conceive them now, and also it will, just mean we can't leave. It's seems like a small question, but it's actually very much at the core of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the sound for you is different than for us.
Yeah.
What is the sound you want us to hear? The sound we hear or you hear?
That's a wonderful question. Yes, it's very true. I was struggling with how to record it. So when I made this piece, or this record here, I can't show you a photo right now, sadly. But what I did is, you can see here this wooden thing, it's a mask. Actually, I don't have a photo. So I wanted to translate a little bit the sensations or the sound experience, because it's not even just that you only also get sound from vibrating your skull and things like that, or because of the location, right? But also the symbol is very interesting. Because it's metal and it's not even, it's impossible to make it even, frequencies move very differently. And that's why it has a bell-like sound. So, and it also means that frequencies travel not, so on a string, if you have a string, frequencies travel like this, right? And it's like the harmonics, you'll probably know that, like multiples of this same movement. On a circular surface, right, if you have a circle, you have these two, and then you have circles, so circle and circle. And they all interact. But this is only is this uniform if all of this material is equally same, you know? But if it is not, then it vibrates in weird ways. So that means if you, sometimes I would bow a sound, it would move like this, like one frequency, because of the strange relationships between notes or between places that move, right? So I wanted to capture this. So what I did is I took this mask And I came up with this by chance. I had the mask, I use it a lot to play, and I had a Zoom recorder, and I didn't have studio. And so I was like, I had some other mics too, but it's like, okay, let's see, what could I do? I could put the Zoom recorder on the mask. So I attached the Zoom recorder in front of the mask, put the mask on my head, and then the symbol on top. And that way, the stereo is right here, and so you can get that whole movement. But also, interestingly, I never would have thought that, but because it's wood, I mean, it makes sense. It also captures the stuff that's felt in your bones. So this record, I mean, you still have the Zoom sound, sadly, like the Zoom microphone sound, but if you check out this record, you can hear sort of like this approach. And then I just do it with regular micings for concerts sometimes, yeah. So yeah, it's a wonderful question. Thank you. Yeah.
As a composer, you of course have to think about space also in time, so how long the piece will be and what kind of form it will have. How? What do you think about that? And of course, it's difficult to explain your process exactly, but how does form? How do you create form as a composer?
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, great question. So one part was this. It's a little strange, but when this kind of emerged, because of thinking sound as space more. So that's one part. But you still have another question of form, right? Because now, except now you have multiple ones. So that is to say, you have the question of form of how you're going to listen. So the listener, what is the listener's role? Like, can I just see everything? And even you can't, like it's impossible, of course, but let's imagine you could. Or do you follow just one of these spaceships, like one trajectory of traveling? Or do you jump around? That is, you almost yourself become something, or like a rocket on here, or are you a planet? And I think most of the time I make listeners become rocket ships, because if you just are on a planet, I mean that could be interesting too. I think most of the time it's rocket ships. If you're just on a planet, you basically always have the same space, which is maybe a bit more, we're more used to it. So you'd have like just new things arrive and space changes and you can witness it. If you're following one rocket, you encounter other things, but you have a very linear narrative. But you still, one thing that will still upset it is your very notion that you're actually moving in space, and that these spaces are not already like recreated and destroyed every time you visit it. So that they have already something there, and that changes over time. And that's, I think, one of the very important parts. And then the other idea is that not every that the listener is a rocket ship, which also means the listener firstly travels, but also listeners become multiple. And that's, I think, what I very often do. So each listener will have a different relation to it. And that is both also in space, but also in terms of what you can actually hear, and also in terms of maybe the speed of how you experience it. But let's say it's a concert situation like this, then it would be mostly maybe space or what you can hear. And then in terms of form, this notion of, so there's this notion of opacity, one, and then I often also think about what is the relationship of the piece to the space I'm entering. Because when I compose, I always think about the relationship of the piece to the performers. So I also must think about the relationship of the piece to the space. One like very clear example is if you have a collaboration across geographical boundaries. For example, I have a collaboration I'm doing with Ensemble Modern, and which is in Germany, and musicians in Senegal, who are mainly drummers there that we're working with. So there is a very different set of languages, for example, Wolof and German, that I have to talk to the musicians too, right? So that's already a consideration of who am I working with or who is making music. Or it's also a consideration of who is listening, because the musicians are the first listeners, right? They're the listeners that I speak to first, that then speak to other listeners, so to speak, and then they talk with them. And I cannot always know what the performers hear. Like, I don't think that that's a good model, to think that the composer can hear what the performers hear. Okay, so through that then emerges the fact that the piece becomes taught as something in relation with the context of what makes the piece, right? So let's say this is this context, so it's about, this automatically becomes part of the form and the narrative, or whatever you want to call it, right, of this piece. So I don't cut that out because I don't think that it can be. So I try to think about it. And this is maybe, not to go too long into it, the sort of beginning of how to think for me about form, or how I realize that in my work form is taught, or narrative. Yeah.
So,
yes,
sorry,
Martin. Yeah.
quickly so am I understanding it right, that relates then to what you were saying earlier about how we define bodies having to do with nation states? Like, form is not something you can own, like a classical or romantic composer would think, but it's an ecology as well. For you.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it's also, that's right, it's connected, you're right. And I think the piece, right, it still has a beginning and an end sometimes, but I mean, a lot of my pieces is hard to tell, but then the piece itself, right, it does something. Like, one analogy, maybe it helps, maybe it won't, but one analogy for me is like to think of musical composition like genetic engineering. So if you write a piece which uses like certain kinds of sounds, right? Let's say Beethoven, right? Beethoven wrote all these long symphonies, and the instruments that he was using, they would detune over the course of this long symphony. So the builders of instruments started making different instruments that could actually play these pieces. The same was the case with Bach, right? In Bach, I mean, of course, it's not just this one composer, but it's multiple composers, multiple musicians, right? But it's just a time period or a general description that we use this name for. Or in Bach's case, right, with the modulating and things like that. So if that's the case, that means that the piece is part of like an exploration or changing of the space of what actually music is, and also what sound is, and also what an instrument is, and also what musical performance is. So that is maybe an addition to what your observation in that. It's not just there is an ecological relation, but also that forms are themselves like almost like nexuses or something, like a place, you know, in space. And when you change this one nexus of connections, and then this one, and then this one, then there's a new space. So we can change the space by hearing new things, which is not new, but it's to listen to the untaught, the unknown, right? It's like a little openness to what we don't understand, to what we can't hear, to what we ignore. And that is actually the catalyst for a very different relationship to ourselves and space and each other. So that's kind of, I guess, how I would put it. Yeah. Yes, please. Thank you.
Space do you leave for your musicians to improvise, or like personal interpretation of these spaces? Is it kind of based on what you wrote and your interpretation, or do they also see the movements and then from their own personal kind of how they imagine it?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question as well. I think so. I think this was actually probably my first explicit way of thinking about spaces in that context, because I started thinking of notation as spaces of interpretation. And that is to say, when I write a C on a staff, everybody knows what a C on a staff is. Do we really? Because if I write it for a violin, or a cello, or a piano, or a guitar, or a vibraphone, it's changing drastically. But then, if there's surrounding material, it changes again, right? Depending on what the surrounding material is. How much material is around it, how fast it is, etc. Then you all are probably really great musicians. I don't know who is composer, who doesn't play, but if you play an instrument, you know, and as I said, it's like speaking. When you enter a room, you tune with the room. So if I say C to you, you'll be like, okay, C, I know I have an understanding with you in a narrative, in a sort of way, or also you and also the sort of larger context, what a C might mean, but I have to adjust certain things depending on where I am. If I throw you now into this virtual space and you have to play a C, you might not even know what that is depending on that space. Because, why? Well, this fundamental might be erased completely. So that kind of shows us that there's always a space of interpretation and or improvisation in every communication or every meeting. And so notation becomes just like the meeting between an instrument and a space, right? It creates that, it's the same for my conception. So then I think about it that way, and I think about what space is each area of notation or each movement or each sound in terms of like how large of a variability does it allow or not. And that's also like making your work more give longevity, I think. For example, if you have a very small notion of your piece, you can actually, how can you perform it 100,000 times? If you have only this interpretation idea of sound, it will change because there will be variations in microsound maybe. You might call it microsound, but then there's Ligeti who actually use that as musical material, right? So that means we always already are thinking that. And so then I take that serious and I say, okay, well, where am I going? How much space am I giving? And who am I talking to again? Because, again, if it's, and which space are we playing in? So if I write the C, who are you? And what do you understand with it? And where are we? And what happens? And what instrument? And how clear is the C in fundamental or not? Yeah. So this is kind of, if that makes sense as an answer, a way to rethink what notation might be. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, okay. And then I'm afraid we'll have to.
Okay. That's
Just question, where do you come from, actually?
Switzerland, yeah.
Okay.
Switzerland, that's where I'm from. I live in the US now. Well, there's a question, yeah.
You said that music could change the world, right? Can you explain how, like throughout which process does that happen and what it means to you?
Yeah. For me, one great example is, so I quoted one person, Marshall Allen, and I think his pretty much exact words were, well, you can make a better world with music even if it's a small one. And I think what the Sun Ra Orchestra did is kind of that. So basically, the Sun Ra Orchestra is a group whose leader is Sun Ra. They started in Chicago in the 50s, and then they were in New York, and then they lived in Philly for most, I guess, of the time of the group. They started in the 50s. Sun Ra was born in 1914, and they're still going today. And Marshall Allen is 98 years old. So these are mainly black musicians in the US, and they created this group which actually it had economic consequences, for example. So it created employment as one part. Another aspect is it's like a school too. So It's like you want to learn to become a musician, you might be allowed to enter, and then you need to learn to sight read through the guidance of your peers and maybe the composer or the leaders. And then you have performances, and you can train or practice and then play, and then you become a musician. So it changes individuals' lives because they learn something, you could say. For example, that's one aspect. Or in the case of the ACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, they created also a collective of composer performers, and they made schools where they could go and study music, young, particularly black people in the south side of Chicago. That was where a lot of people migrated to from the south of the US. So it gave a new space, it gave economic things because you start putting your money together, things like that, etc., etc. For me, one of the things that I saw that was mind-boggling is this experience of alongside, of course, of Voices, which is happened in Switzerland, and through it we were able to talk about Black life in Switzerland, and that's kind of something that doesn't really always have a space. And how it happened, it's kind of a long story, but it's very interesting because music is like at the core of it too. So it doesn't mean we can just make music and everything's changed, but it means that music is always already entangled in the world, right? And if it is so, then it also can effectuate things in the world. Just like when we, and maybe we need to think even beyond musicians and music as a closed field, just like hearing the sound of Mars. I'm pretty sure that's going to change a lot about our conception of our planet, and we will see that evolve or take fruit over some years now. But that changes radically what we think of ourselves. Like when we went to the moon, when humanity went to the moon, it changed a lot about thinking of ourselves, right? So these are all small, I guess, pointers to how we could think that, but also on the individual levels, as your question, it's like when we hear differently our relationship to a space. Like I hear, let's say I hear myself in relationship to this space, like this space and me is separate things, and I just need to be about me and see what is good in this space for me and what is bad for me. So I go in this space and I destroy whatever is bad for me, and I reap whatever is good for me, and the space is destroyed, right? That's colonization. But if I think about space like, oh, what can I hear that I never heard before, and how is this space changing me? You're automatically entering another kind of way of interacting with the space. And maybe you notice like, oh, if I grow a bunch of plants here, I'm happy. And then that is a small change, but I think it's a radical shift in how we think space, ourselves, and so forth and so forth. And it's always already there. It's not like it's something we have to go and find somewhere else, but it's actually also, we can say, somewhere else in the terms of maybe Sun Ra Orchestra and some other place, even though that place is right here, right? So hope that points to some approaches or way of thinking, and more things to study, like if you want, like the ACM or the Sun Ra Orchestra, and so many other. I mean, there's countless examples. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.